Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's CIS Controls webinar initiative, Cybersecurity for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises Using the CIS Controls. My name is Robin Regnier from CIS, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Our webcast will be recorded and available on the CIS website. A review of a few housekeeping items. Please keep the background noise to a minimum. Mute your phone. View the presentation in full screen mode by selecting the expand icon. Use the question mark icon to open the Q&A window to enter your question during the webinar. Be sure to click the send button to all panelists. Today's agenda will include an introduction of our discussion group members, a summary overview of the SME guide, a group discussion, a Q&A session, and a closing. Many small and medium-sized enterprises struggle with budgets and limited staff to respond to the continuing cyber problem. The newly published implementation guide for SMEs for CIS Controls focuses on a subset of the CIS Controls specifically selected to help protect SMEs that lists a variety of free or low-cost tools as well as procedures SMEs can implement to improvise their security posture. I would like to hand the webinar over to Phil Langlois, our Technical Project Manager for the SME Guide.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robin. I really want to take an opportunity here to kind of introduce myself in a little bit in terms of what CIS has been trying to do with the controls. So like Robin mentioned, I'm the Technical Product Manager for the controls. My main responsibility is to assure that we can provide content and tools to help organizations implement the controls. And this specific guide is actually one of many kind of different series of guides out there that focus on different topics. We have guides that we actually covered a few months ago regarding privacy. We have some for mobile technology, as well as Internet of Things. But this actually, I think, guide has a special place in our heart. We had the opportunity to travel to California actually last year and present to a lot of different small business councils and small businesses on cybersecurity. And this is where we realized that there is a big need that's not necessarily being met right now in terms of some of the guidance and recommendations we have. So that's where we started looking, back to what are the things that organizations absolutely should do to protect themselves against the attacks out there. And we're very fortunate to have some amazing volunteers, some of which are with us today on the panel, to provide their expertise and their experiences in terms of what those actions are. And with that, we created a guide that focuses in terms of the different tools and techniques out there that should be accessible to most people. We understand that not every organization has access to cybersecurity expertise or necessarily has the time to go and implement these complex frameworks. So we really focus in terms of very concrete and actionable things that small and medium businesses can do. So I'm very excited to have these panelists on and provide some of their experiences in this domain. And I'm going to pass it over to Tony Sager, who has been kind of one of the leading forces behind the controls and definitely one of the forefathers in terms of this cybersecurity guidance. So over to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Phil. I think forefather means I'm old. I appreciate that. In fact, yesterday was my 40th anniversary in this business. I started in 1977 on 26 September at the National Security Agency and spent 35 years there working these defensive kinds of problems, mostly from a vulnerability analysis point of view, and have been really lucky since I retired in the work of the last 5 years to be associated now with the Center for Internet Security, CIS, around the notion of the controls and all the things that go with it. For me, in a second career, it was a chance to take some of the ideas that evolved during my career dealing with this as a national security kind of nation-to-nation sort of a problem and really think about it as applied to the rest of society. And that's consistent with the nature of the problem. That is, the world of the 70s and 80s, no one really cared about this kind of stuff except for governments. And, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have this sort of technology basis for every business transaction, every social interaction that we have. And so this has become just a way of life for all of us, which means at some level we all have to worry about this problem. But we are not going to create, an economy full of cybersecurity businesses, right? Most of us are doing other things. And so how do we help people defend themselves in a complex, fast-changing world? And that's really the heart of what CIS is all about. Now, this, as Phil said, this topic really brings out a strong passion. You'll hear it in our panelists here. Everyone I've talked to over the last couple of years on this topic sees a tremendous need, both as someone who has to survive, but also as a security professional. How do we help everyone get better? And I live in a part of the country of, my doctor's a one-man practice, my lawyer, there's 2 people, my dentist, there's 2 people in the practice. There's no IT staff, there's no security professionals on staff. So and yet they have to deal with all the complexity of electronic records and demands from their clients for access to electronic services. So it's a very complicated world for them. So those are some of the things that really inspired us to think about this problem and try to put together some work. The work of the CIS Controls, has been around for several years. It really started as a 2-page thing and that blossomed into really a worldwide activity supported by a large army of volunteers around the world to both create the content and support it over time. And that's really what CIS is all about. Its power is not in the sort of employees of CIS, and we're really proud of our employees, but it's really about our ability to bring together expertise across the community, create good ideas, build them into things, documents and tools and so forth. But I think just as important is sustaining them over time. I mentioned having 40 years plus in this business now, and I've seen many a good idea just disappear because no one planned for long-term support or sustainment. And that's what CIS is really about. Let's make sure that we both do good things, but make sure that they stay current and are supported over time. So I'm going to give you a little bit of quick overview of our panelists today, and you'll hear, we're very lucky to have 3 outstanding panelists, people that were both active in this project and are just great citizens of the cybersecurity community and bring a lot to both this problem and lots of other work in their day jobs. So I'm going to give them each a chance to introduce themselves, maybe take 2 to 3 minutes max to talk about their background and their interest in this topic here. And then we'll go into Q&A. I think there's should be instructions for you to send questions in electronically. You can send them in as we go. You can send them in at the end. I'll be monitoring the Q&A window to make sure that we try to pick those questions up and make sure that we get a chance to address the things that you really care about. Because this is not about us. This is about you and the questions that you have. If we don't get to every question, we'll do our best to get back to you. You can also reach us later at CIS. There'll be some contact information posted later, a general purpose email address that you can send questions in later if something comes up. And all of our panelists have agreed that they would be happy to engage and provide some answers afterwards, even outside the webinar. So our 3 panelists, Russell, I'm going to let you kick off the talk here. Russell Eubanks, an old friend of mine and a great contributor to this project. Go ahead, Russell.
Thanks, Tony. It's a privilege to be a part of this. And like you said, it's really as a volunteer army and a movement that I've been privileged to be involved with for quite a long time. Certainly not equipped to speak on behalf of my organization, my day job there, but do want to, as a fellow security practitioner, really encourage those of you on the webcast to really lean into this idea of what would it look like if you were to take this guide and lean into and make your organization more cyber secure than what it was before. When you look at the critical security controls, these 20 things, they sound like good ideas. It certainly map to actual attacks that have occurred in the environment. But as we're looking at small and medium-sized organizations, Tony, you gave the example of people that you work with who don't have an IT team. What are they supposed to do? How do they react when they see news, especially this month, of yet another breach, yet another compromise? How can they not have to become or hire or work with security experts, but use this particular manual to say, what are the certain areas that we can do, again, aligned to the controls, but looking at the 3 different key areas of knowing, protecting, and preparing your organization, no matter how small or how medium-sized it might be, to position itself to respond effectively. And that's what I really enjoy about this community and about this guide in particular, is its actionable steps. It certainly is going to be phase 1. It's certainly not everything, but a very healthy, very well thought out process to say, how can we as small, medium organizations apply these controls on a regular basis and really make an improvement for our cybersecurity posture.
Sounds great, Russell, and good kickoff on your comments there. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit later about your experiences, because you've lived this life of the small enterprise. And next up, if you could introduce yourself, Hardeep Malhotra, another contributor to this project.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Yeah, I've worked in the information security space within government, law enforcement, private sector, and small businesses in the past 18 years. Been involved in a lot of cybercrime investigations, also doing security assessments and management of breaches. What I would like to say is I'm quite passionate, volunteering my time through CIS, and it's really an honor to be part of this in building this guide and helping small businesses. It's a great opportunity, and I would like to also say, I'd like to echo Russell and Tony's comments as, using this guide, small businesses and medium-sized businesses, using this guide as a phase 1 to leverage some of the great work and to start somewhere in securing the environment. I think there's a lot of challenges with small businesses and medium-sized businesses to kind of say, okay, we can't apply this entire framework, but at least, we need to start somewhere, and this is a great opportunity to start somewhere and start securing the environment.
Yep, wonderful, thanks, Hardeep. And finally on our panel, Kristin Judge. Kristin, have a little intro to yourself and your interest in this topic.
Great, thanks, Tony, and to the CIS team. I got my start in cybersecurity with the great Will Pelgrin and the CIS team, and I feel like it's such an honor to be on this call today. I have been working in cybersecurity from a non-technical standpoint with people like small business owners, elected officials, and people that don't quite understand what cybersecurity means to them. And as I go around the country trying to teach regular folks, consumers and businesses about cybersecurity, there's been so many times when they say, just give me a list. I'm so busy running my shop doing this, can you just give me a list? I'll follow a list, but just write down a list for me. And so when I saw the work that Phil and the team were doing at CIS, I was so thrilled, because this is exactly the kind of document that I have been hearing from small and medium businesses and small and medium governments out there saying, just help us out, write it down, let us know what we have to do, and we'll do it. So it's really exciting to be a part of this project.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Yeah, and it's kind of a theme for all 3 of you, right? This, let's get started. One of the challenges for the small enterprise, you don't have a room full of security professionals. And by the way, security professionals often talk a good game, but they're just as confused as anybody else. But the problem and the solutions can just seem so overwhelming. And that's one of the things that really spurred the creation of the CIS controls. The most frequent question I was getting when I started really doing a lot of public speaking in the mid-2000s was, hey, this is great stuff, but what do I do first? And I would point to the usual things, oh, there's NIST things here and checklists there and benchmarks there and blah, blah, blah. And people say, yeah, but what do I do first? I have to convince the boss to spend the first dollar, the first hour of our time, the first, chart in front of the senior executives at a meeting. People were really struggling with that first step. And that's a lot of what CIS is about, as noted here. How do we help people intelligently prioritize and focus their attention in a really complicated world? And lots of security professionals, for good reasons, they think of, they use what I call the special snowflake school of security, right? We're all special and unique, and every business is unique, and every threat. And yeah, that's true. But, we actually have more in common in cyber defense, I think, than we do that's different. So by focusing on what we have in common, it gives us a chance to get started. Anyway, so let's jump into some questions here with this distinguished group. And again, you know, for all those that are listening in on the webcast, these are extraordinary folks and examples of the kind of great people that get brought together under the CIS umbrella. So our power is really not us, it's really about the community at large. And if you're ever interested in becoming a part of this community, both more directly, don't hesitate to reach out to us. So let me open up with, hey, Hardeep, let me jump right to you on a couple of questions here, given your experience. You know, there's a sort of we've all heard the term too big to fail. Let's talk about our small businesses sort of too small to be attacked. What should they be worried about, right? You know, we can understand why people go after big financial institutions, but little businesses, not much going on. What really is the threat there? What should people be concerned about?
Thanks, Tony. You know, I'd like to just kind of start off with, I read a recent article, actually it was posted on CNN, right? And it states that, you know, 14 million U.S. businesses, small to medium-sized businesses are at risk of a hacker threat. You know, when you kind of read something like that, the number seems extraordinarily large, right? However, you know, as I read through the article, I guess the key takeaway, even for me and in my experience, is that, you know, large organizations, I guess they spend hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in cybersecurity controls. Whereas, you know, small growing businesses don't always have that, you know, capacity or capability to have, you know, a dedicated security program or go through control frameworks, as you alluded to earlier, and secure their environment. But, you know, if you think about it, most consumers actually interact majority of the times on a daily basis with small businesses. Like you look at doctors, lawyers, or online businesses that are growing up now. These businesses actually have a lot of sensitive customer information. They're collecting information on a daily basis. However, if you look at it, they actually don't, because they don't have the capability or capacity sometimes, they have less stringent security controls, which typically make them an easy target for any kind of malicious actor. You know, I was also looking at a small business survey which was conducted in April by CNBC, which identified only 2% of the small businesses actually thought that cyber attack was one of the most critical issues they face, because they're more concerned about, you know, running their business and operating. However, you know, when you look at some of these small businesses, you know, they're subject to like spear phishing or, you know, just exploitation of the network or ransomware, right? And they don't have the capability or capacity to recover from that. In my experience, again, small businesses don't always have, you know, like a strong business continuity or disaster recovery plans, which is like backing up their data, or in the event of a ransomware attack, you know, they're more prone to it, and, you know, the data is encrypted and they don't have a way to basically recover from that because the data is all stored locally. I guess, you know, finally, in my experience I've seen is that, you know, small businesses don't just have the capability or capacity to you know, conduct these, you know, go through these frameworks or conduct incident response, or, and it actually is really damaging when they are impacted by a security incident. And some of them we've seen that are actually gone out of business because of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think this sort of large-scale professionalization of crime, for example, you know, means that you don't need to be a major dollar-wise target to be part of the challenge here. You know, the thing that hit me, just a quick anecdote, about 18 months ago, that really brought this small business thing home. You know, like many a tech guy, I'm sitting in a Starbucks waiting for a teleconference to start, and at the table next to me is a lady talking to a friend of hers, and she was pretty upset. I did not interrupt their conversation, but she had just been fired a couple of days before from her job as the CFO of a very small business. And, you know, when she described what happened, I don't mind admitting I was listening in, it was classic what's called CEO fraud. You know, get an email late on a Friday, supposedly from the boss, quick, need you to wire some money to this account number because I'm about to close a big deal and you can't reach me for the next couple hours because we're in a meeting, blah, blah, blah. You know, she was heading out of the office on vacation and, you know, innocently did the right thing, came back, you know, and obviously the money was lost to the ether someplace. But, you know, in the scale of sort of grand businesses, it wasn't very much. But for that business, it was devastating, and the woman lost her job instantly, you know, and, you know, I was, you know, overhearing this and thinking, oh my gosh, do we expect every small business in the country to have everyone being able to spot this kind of problem on their own? That just makes no sense from a sort of scale, national economy, you know, security of businesses sort of a thing. Yet here we are. That's the kind of thing that we have to deal with. Hey, Russell, let me shift to you real quick because you know, I know your story and that you have lived this life, as I hinted. That is, you started at a small company with what I call the ZBC, the Zero Budget Cyber Defense, and really contributed, you know, thought a lot about this problem without sort of big company resources behind you. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of how you started with that and maybe inspire some of the other folks who are in a similar situation?
Absolutely, Tony, and what a privilege it was. You know, when I heard about the controls long time ago and heard the testimonies of different companies who very big, applied a lot of money and a lot of resources and drastically reduced the amount of risk that their organization was carrying, I thought, you know what, I'm inspired. I want to do something, but, you know, I'm a team of one. I don't have the funding. I don't have the support and project managers and all these things, but, you know what, I'm motivated. I'm eager to get started. And so really took inspiration from success stories at large companies and said, well, what can I do? What are ways that I could lean into knowing much, much quicker when change occurs in my environment? Through automation, using all free open source tools, or even in some cases taking some of the tools I had that were in place and then finding some capabilities that were perhaps not enabled that allowed me to know better what was installed on my systems, what types of hosts were on my network, and should they be on my network based on that. And it was really a journey that I went through. And again, I didn't have the money, but I had motivation and I had time, and really focused on that and really made a big difference. And a key to that, Tony, was having automation, having a script or having a process that ran as a scheduled task or something that ran on a regular basis to give me much sooner indication of changes that were occurring in my environment. I published a paper on that, did some presentations, and it really allowed me to become a part of this community by, again, just leaning into what was that body of work that was out there, the results that were so clearly communicated really inspired me to do something. And I think that, you know, having actionable steps that says, what can I do to know the hardware? What can I do to know the software on my systems? What can I do to look at the number of people who have administrative access, those who could do damage to our environment, or who through social engineering could be tricked into doing damage like what you mentioned earlier? And again, I just would encourage all the attendees to think in terms of what can you do right now, and maybe even use that to make the business case for future funding, future support, future growth, and really leaning into and knowing better how, especially for small and medium business that don't have the program support, what are the things that they can go through and really make a profound difference in their organization.
Yeah, this is a great example, Russell. For the benefit of the audience, you know, a number of these ideas, when Russell describes it, his description is modest, but he really did start with a zero budget and looked around. And I think the way you just heard him describe it, right? One value of this project and of the controls in general is, again, allowing you to not try to solve world hunger and peace in our time, you know, in the next 90 days, but instead focus in on kind of the thing that you need to do. Whether it's understand the devices that come in and out of your environment, control the execution of software, make sure that you manage the number of people with administrative privilege and so forth. You know, getting focused in on a more concrete set of things as opposed to trying to deal with the complexity of the problem across the board is really a central philosophy of the things that we're trying to do here at CIS. And present that to you in a way that's digestible, you know. And so that's part of the I think value that we can help bring. The other part of that, Russell, I'll mention is, you know, can you say anything about the notion of having not you dream up the list of things to do, but pointing to an independent source of you know, sort of prioritization and so. Was that helpful to you in selling the idea to management?
It was, and I think, you know, there's so many lists of good things to do this,
right,
do that, a lot of things based on industry, but having a collective group such as Center for Internet Security and all the organizations and volunteer army who've helped to define these really puts us and puts the community at an advantage. It says not just Russell's bright idea or Tony's bright idea, but this community of people who agree that in addition to doing the things that you have to do for compliance and regulation and all the reasons that you have, have, here are things that actually improve the security of our organization. Many of them, many if not all these, map to things you have to do anyway, but really looking at these as technical controls you can put in place to make sure that you're able to know sooner and respond better when bad things occur in your given environment. But again, having that authoritative source that says not just my idea, but the community of really smart people have agreed and can show that when you do these things, you can really drive improvement in your organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to present it, Russell. You know, again, thinking of, you know, one of the phrases I use in my talks is it's not about the list. Right? You can get a great list of things to do from, you know, various government lists or magazine articles, or, you know, we'll see a ton of them fly out of here in National Cybersecurity Awareness Month over the next few weeks. But, you know, it's really about the other products like that Phil mentioned earlier, the support of a community, people to ask questions of. You know, most of us, I think, at least in this space, learn best by learning from someone who's solved a similar problem. The challenge is, can you find them? You know, and so one of the things we can do is help connect people in similar situations. Let me move on to Kristen for kind of a different angle here. Because Kristen, you live and breathe the human element of this, right? The behavior of people, the role of human beings. Share with us some of your observations about this particular community, small, medium enterprises, and the challenges there, and your thoughts on sort of what they ought to be focused in on.
First of all, I'm thrilled that they're finally starting to come to the table and not just put their head in the sand. So I think we are making some progress compared to years ago. And when I meet with small, medium business enterprise folks, I say just start with one step at a time. Build cybersecurity into your business culture. Just like if you run a restaurant, we've built in food sanitation requirements. We can make cybersecurity part of the business's what we do every day. But they have to also remember they're an expert on physical security. They already keep their business doors locked when the office is closed. They have cameras in place. And so I try and make a relationship between those kinds of things and security steps like adding strong authentication, having software to monitor your web traffic. And so up until a few years ago, they really weren't listening to the ideas out there, but now I feel like we have the audience paying attention. And as I go around the country, we're trying to make sure people feel empowered. Using these CIS critical controls, I know that every business now can do something to improve their security. And if we just get them to start with step one and know what you have so that you can start protecting it, I think that's a really good first step.
Yep, wonderful point. I think you're right. It is paralyzing, I think, for a lot of folks. There's a lot of unique technical jargon. A lot of complexity. There's a lot of wizards who make their living out of complexity, and trying to, not dumb down the problem, but simplify it in terms of behaviors that people can actually execute on. In public health, we don't expect everyone to become an expert on immunology and the spread of disease. We define behaviors. Get your shots, right? Avoid certain situations or certain behaviors that allow you to kind of manage your day. But we know that those behaviors are backed up by some science, right? People that are specializing and thinking about this and doing research and so forth. And we haven't been able to quite codify that in this space yet. But at the end of the day, most of us are not experts in building codes and auto mechanics and public health, et cetera, but we can navigate pretty well, not perfectly, but certainly pretty well as citizens, if we can define the right kind of behaviors in a concrete way for people. So I think those are all really important. I just want to jump to one question that we've gotten online, asked about the kind of attack data that's used, I'll say, as backdrop or input to the controls. Phil has actually worked this quite a bit, but let me just say a couple of things here. We have an ongoing relationship with many of the big threat intelligence companies and folks that publish things like the annual summaries of attacks and so forth. You can find us referenced in the Verizon Data Breach Report, in some of the annual reports out of folks like Symantec and HP and say Palo Alto. I can't name them all right offhand, but we work with those kinds of folks. We don't have access by design. We don't want access to all their raw data. What we really work with them on is the summaries, trends, patterns of activity by bad guys, and so forth. And we scan all that kind of information. And our job there is to translate all that complicated, specialized, noisy, millions of data points of bad things into a relatively small number of positive, constructive things that you can do. And, it's the kind of thing that if you have a big security staff at your company, you have them reading all these same things, right? They're doing this because it's just part of the backdrop of information. But certainly for small, medium enterprises, they typically do not have a big team of people just waiting breathlessly for these annual reports and the tax summaries to come out. So what we think of that is we crowdsource that. That is, we're following all that kind of information with lots of bright, knowledgeable people and attempting to translate it into things like the CIS controls, the guidance that's under the hood of the small business guide, et cetera. So all these kinds of things are think of it as things that you would do if you were a big, well-funded, lots of expertise sort of a company. But frankly, most of us are not. So how do we combine our labor, put our heads together, and pull that information into one place? And whenever I hear the term threat sharing, that verb share, I always challenge people, think about a different verb, translate, right? You don't actually want to read tens or hundreds of millions of data points of attacks. What you really want is a translation of that into positive action. So that's what we're really all about here. Kristen, since I had you last, let me ask you another question before I move on to some of the others that have come in online. And talk to us about sort of incidents, cybersecurity incidents, which have just become a way of life, right? They strike everybody. What should, at a human and sort of behavioral level, what things ought small businesses be thinking about in terms of preparing themselves for what might become inevitable?
Well, following steps in the CIS Controls Guide are really key to preparing for an incident. You have to think about this before it actually happens. Number one, know what you have. Number two, protect it with technology and employee training, because we know the humans really are the best way for the bad guys to get into a system. And number three, have a response plan in place before the breach, because if you're trying to scramble after the breach, you're not going to do it in the best way for your company. Every company should have a response plan, and they don't have to write their own. The Federal Communications Commission has a cyber planner. The Federal Trade Commission has great resources on data breach guide. You've got the CIS controls here. Have a plan in place. Sit down with your team before a breach happens so that when the breach happens, you aren't scrambling and making mistakes.
Yeah, that's great advice. And the common wisdom, at least in the government, was always in the aftermath of a cyber incident is the worst possible time to meet your general counsel. It's
exactly.
you want to figure that out ahead of time. How about any particular angle for these small businesses, though? Because a number of them might not have everybody on staff. They may instead contract for legal services, an IP attorney, for example, or other folks. So it seems inevitable that a comprehensive incident response plan would include people that are not employees. Any thoughts there?
Absolutely. There's all kinds of steps out there that talk about making sure that the vendors that you use, because if you ask for information from people, PII, personal identifying information, you're responsible for that data regardless of what vendors you send it off to. So it's really important that you're asking good questions of your cloud providers or the vendors to make sure that security is built in on what they do.
Gotcha, thanks. Hey, Russell, let me direct, there's a series of questions that have come in online about kind of the general issue of outsourcing or managed services. And I think, my observation, a lot of businesses, again, they don't have on-staff IT people. They certainly don't have rooms full of their own servers. They're outsourcing a lot of both IT operations and also security stuff to specialty companies. What should a small enterprise be thinking about? How would I know a good service provider from one that's not so good? Or what kind of questions should I be asking?
Yeah, I think, Tony, this guide, the implementation guide for small, medium enterprises, could not only be applicable for inside the organization, but also with the partners that you do business with. Maybe you have IT functions, call center functions, all types of different functions where you're contracting with an outside party to perform certain work for you through contract negotiations, terms and conditions, gosh, even asking questions, going through these lens of how well do you know, how good of a steward are you, third-party provider of my data? Do you know to call me? Do you know to not behave in certain ways or put data on a publicly accessible websites as examples? I think it could very well be such that you can ask these same types of questions of them as you're working in contract negotiations, as you're doing contract renewals, to really help you understand better how's that data being worked with, manipulated, stored, processed, et cetera. So I think it's a fantastic way to start that conversation, and then wait for really good answers that demonstrate their commitment to not only customer service, but for data protection and stewardship of the information you've entrusted them with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically take the ideas and sort of have them in your left hand while you're discussing with potential service providers and so forth, you know, what they can do.
Absolutely, and use that as a matrix to determine how effective they are. Maybe you use that as some of the selection criteria for as you're making a decision between which of the vendors to work with.
Gotcha. Hey, Hardeep, also you have, I know, relevant experience too. Any thoughts on this business of outsourcing and the use of service providers from your perspective?
Yeah, and I would say is definitely use the small business guide as a mechanism as you're dealing with vendors, right? Maybe pose the same questions, use the small business guide and the recommendations in there, and pose those questions to the vendors before you're actually evaluating all the vendors to kind of see how well their cybersecurity programs are, or what services they're offering and what controls they have in the environment. And that may give you a better perspective in terms of whether you want to do business with them or not.
Yeah, something like this. Again, you know, to the webcast audience here, remember this: CIS is not some mystery think tank off in some, you know, lonely building someplace. We are you, right? We are the community. So your priorities are our priorities, and so, you know, think about the suggestions that the two gents just had about, you know, how to use the guide that we've produced as a guide to help you with outsourcing issues. But also think about, could we produce other products from CIS? And by the way, you can be on the team to help us think about these kinds of things and help others with exactly this kind of a problem. Hardeep, let me kind of redirect another question to you about, because we've got a couple questions about the language barrier in technology and in IT and in cybersecurity. So typically businesses, you know, again, are not going to have large professional IT staffs. And I think a big barrier to even characterizing the problem, much less the solution, is the language barrier. You know, those of us that have grown up in this, we accept a high level of jargon and acronyms as just a way of life. But, you know, how much should we expect out of small businesses in terms of how much do they need to learn to survive in this? Or on the flip side, what should we as technologists and security professionals be doing to, I'll say, make our work more accessible to others?
Thanks, Tony. You know, I would say is from a small business owner, they're typically not technical people, and you know, and a lot of them don't understand security, right? Mm-hmm. So you know, and that's the main reason when we were writing the small business guide, right, the SME guide, we wanted to make sure that, you know, we wanted to leave the language simple, but we also wanted to provide them with some, you know, open source tools or places where they can actually go and download, or somebody can help them download, right? But I totally understand the frustration, because even within the organization, there's, you know, when we're talking to business units, we really need to do a better job in translating, you know, technical jargon to business terms and really talking about risk, right? And that's kind of, in my experience, that's whenever I'm doing assessments, that's what I've practiced. But what I would say is for in looking at the small SME guide, what we're trying to do is pull out all the technical jargon and really focus on like the very basic general cyber hygiene, the way I call it, right? Mm-hmm. Controls that you can adapt in your environment, and stray away from the technical jargon and really focus on how do you protect your environment with some simple things.
Gotcha, makes sense. And there's a series of questions that come in online about, I'll say, either free or very low-cost tools, or maybe recommendations for, you know, what's the most valuable tool I could be using. Phil, if you're on the line still, would you mind addressing that? Because I know you've spent a lot of time scouring the landscape for what we call low/no-cost tools and have a pretty good sense of of what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. So the good news is I think the cybersecurity field as a whole has matured significantly over the years, and a lot of the tools required to secure your operating system are actually built in within the operating system themselves. And if not, there's a lot of free tools that are either available from the vendors. Vulnerability management solutions often offer smaller but still relatively comprehensive components of their tools for free, kind of a demo or kind of a trial effort. So there's a lot of resources you can get right out of the bat, like I said, from your own operating system or from other kind of tools out there. We have a small list that's included as part of the guide that really ties back for each individual steps, what the specific tools that, we have had experience with that would be useful for end users. And we've really focused in terms of usability as one of the criteria to, determine our recommendations. It's not by any way a holistic list, but it does provide at least a starting point in a few places to look. And, there's a lot of resources out there that kind of provide similar information.
Yeah, one of the, again, as I mentioned, Phil, to the audience, I mentioned Phil has spent a lot of time talking to vendors, sort of scouring the landscape, and some of that we've compiled into the guide, some of it we are collecting separately. Again, if you're a small business, you don't have the professional team to spend days looking for this kind of stuff. That's a perfect place for all of us to share labor, right? Maybe you know of a couple things that have been useful to you, and you'd like to share that experience with us at CIS so that we can share it more broadly. And we are talking very regularly to folks at Microsoft about sort of what part of their tools is unused. Every vendor in this space I've talked to, and I've talked to many of them over the years, they all use a number something like 30%, as in, hey, the customer is only using 30% of what we sold them. And it's amazing how consistent that is across security vendors, IT and OS vendors, et cetera. And so part of us, the value we can provide is working with them to kind of pull those things out, right? Things that they believe they've already given you but are buried somewhere in the distribution, or you just don't have the people and the time to dig those things out. So if you have some favorites, let us know. If you have some sort of needs that you can't find that are met, let us know what those are. And we have within our community the ability to reach out and kind of look across these things and then see if we can put that together and maintain it. As I said, great ideas will just wither up and die if we don't have a central place to keep them current, delete the things that are no longer relevant, add the new things, and so forth. Kristen, I want to come back to you about, one of the challenges in the cyberspace business is lots of traditional, I'll call them associations or mechanisms available to small, medium businesses all find themselves in the cybersecurity business now. And I'm thinking of things like the Small Business Administration and other kind of organizations. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of who sees themselves in this? Are there other resources that small businesses can start looking for that might be helpful, or maybe about the changing role of these more traditional gatherings or associations of small businesses and what you see is coming forward from them?
Absolutely. So in my work at the National Cybersecurity Alliance, I've actually been working with 10 federal agencies, and I was just as surprised as you that there are 10 agencies that have people where their job is to do cybersecurity outreach to small and medium enterprises. So we work with everyone from the Secret Service, Federal Trade Commission, DHS, FBI. I was really surprised that there are that many folks working on small and medium enterprise outreach for cybersecurity. But the great thing is we're meeting once a month. All 10 of these agencies get together on the phone and sometimes in person to talk about creating tools in tandem. So the Federal Trade Commission, for example, is partnering with us right now doing small business roundtables around the country at some of our events and listening to small and medium business owners saying, what do you need? And how would you like to get the information? Do you want it in videos? Do you want it in white papers? And so if you look at the ftc.gov/smallbusiness, that's a fantastic area to get all kinds of videos and things. But NCSA is just about to launch, you're all hearing it first, in October, the Cyber Secure My Business program. And on our Stay Safe Online website, we're going to have a community of small and medium businesses and sort of a one-stop shop. We'll be obviously including all of the CIS great materials, but also materials from 10 federal agencies and our private sector partners. So we want to be the one-stop shop for people to get information about SME cybersecurity because there are so many people working on this. It's a little intimidating sometimes for the business owners to find the right place. So we're hoping to fill that void.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Also, interested in your perspective, there's one of the questions online. This is from someone who works at a managed service provider who wants to do a conscientious job in security, it sounds like, but they're having difficulty convincing their smaller customers to think about this, right? So we have a supply and demand situation here. We've been talking about how small businesses can use outsourcing, can use contracts and so forth to ask for better security. But what about from the flip side of this, a provider who wants to do a better job in security but is struggling to get customers to demand it? Any advice from that side?
Yeah, I would start by not using the word cybersecurity and just say, I want to help you with risk management. I want to show you the ROI on using this service I have. Talk to them about their business case. If you're an accountant, I want to make sure that I protect your your client's data. But don't start with cybersecurity. I think of myself as an interpreter because I don't have all those technology words in my first language. We really have to make this very simple. I was at an event one time and teaching, and this gentleman came up to me and he said, I own a business of 10 employees. I'm on a kindergarten level. You're clearly on a college level, but thank you for making it so I can understand. And this is a man in his 60s to admit he was on a kindergarten level, and it really made me realize we cannot talk over these folks. We've got to make it really usable. So if you're at a company trying to help someone with their cybersecurity, start by using words that mean something to them.
Well, that's great advice, Kristen. Yeah, I started up experimenting, I'll say, with very, very local audiences. The men's group at church, the local Lions Club, and so forth, and giving talks there. And then these are wonderful human beings doing great things, for the economy and the country who don't speak this stuff. And I've taken the approach that you just recommended, right? When I give a talk on cybersecurity, I said, whenever you see the word cyber, replace it with one of the following. And it's something like fraud, theft, bullying, so forth. Because that resonates with people, right? The notion that people are trying to steal what I have, or they're trying to, assert some control over something that I have. And as technologists, as you pointed out, right, we grow up with a certain kind of language, and it's so natural to us. And yet, I think it was Hardeep that mentioned, we got to learn to change our thinking here. People, normal people, I'm not saying that you cyber professionals aren't normal, but the rest of the world doesn't speak what we speak, right? And they don't make security decisions in the way that we do. They make economic decisions and social decisions and so forth. So if we want to be useful to society, we have to learn to put what we know in those kinds of terms. So I think that's a great example of that. Hey, Hardeep, let me shift directions with you a little bit. I have a couple of questions about what I might loosely call breakage issues. So you say you're the security pro and you want to put in some new feature that, whether it's two-factor this or some kind of architectural change, and you get a lot of pushback either on sort of change in general or potential breakage and sort of fear of management. Anything in your experience about how people can successfully kind of navigate this challenge of doing something different that potentially has some negative consequence to it?
Yeah, I think number one, as we all alluded to earlier, is really we need to speak their language. I think that's when it resonates a lot better. The next thing is presenting that in more of a risk manner, so they understand, like, a lot of the business units, a lot of the business owners, they all understand the risk of doing the X is and what the implications are. And when they understand, okay, here's the risk and here's the consequences, they're more willing to listen, right? And that's where you get a lot more success in whatever control that you're recommending or whatever technology that you want to apply in the environment. That's kind of where you're more successful, and at least I find that I've been more successful when speaking with a lot more businesses. That when you speak their language, and it resonates better to them, they are more willing to deal with that piece.
Yeah, so it's involve them in the decision, right? But as you said, we have to learn to phrase, what is the desired outcome? And that's some of the language we try to get to with this, with this new product. It's not about a technology issue. It's about, do I understand what's on my network, right? Do I know who can change the security properties? Who has the ability to bypass my security? trying to focus in on the plain English desired good property as opposed to the sort of technology issue of, the complexity and so forth. And, thinking about it that way, I think is healthy advice. Let me ask you another question, Hardeep, about, there's one question here, a term that's starting to pop up in the industry now are things like a virtual CISO and sort of that sort of thing, that is people who have either service or people have decided they would rather outsource even what seems like a pretty senior company responsibility because of the difficulty of finding either the right people or the desirability of doing this in a way that's much more flexible. Any thoughts about that? Is that a desirable strategy? Does it make sense?
I think, there's pros and cons to each option, right? Where the organization, I think it comes down to fundamentals. Fundamentals is that, there needs to be some general, as I said, hygiene, whether we call it cyber hygiene or, fraud hygiene, whatever term you want to use to kind of make sure that, you're addressing the risk. How you address that, whether you address that through like an outsourcing organization that specializes in that, or whether you build that expertise in-house, that's typically a business decision. I know a lot of organizations are, transferring the risk and saying, might as well outsource that piece to an organization that specializes in that, and there's benefits to that. I think in the end, it all comes down to those fundamental pieces that we've identified in the SME guide, like knowing your environment. So, whether it's an outsourcing company that's doing it and protecting your environment, or you decide to insource it, I think that's a business decision. But, knowing your environment and protecting your environment and having that mechanism of incident response are those three key fundamentals. How an organization decides to do that, that's a business decision.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And it's consistent with the notion, right? People don't want security for its own sake. It really is a business and an economic decision, right? We don't spend infinite amounts of money for safety on the job, right? We have a risk model that we're executing in our heads about what should I be spending to minimize danger to my workforce or problems with the consumer use of products and so forth. And again, we have a track record in many other disciplines, but not so much in this area here. So I think a lot of this is about maturing this business. Sometimes I refer to the current state of cybersecurity as we're just barely in what I would call the emergence from wizardry stage. We're moving from a world of scruffy looking people and brilliant attacks that we can't stop to really thinking of this more as an economic and social issue, and therefore what investment is it worth to manage this, and can I outsource parts of it, can I insure myself against certain kinds of losses, and we're seeing sort of the maturation of this in general. Russell, I wanted to give you a shot at one of our last questions here around a couple questions that popped in about things like you mentioned you were able to automate a number of things that is make them sort of routine. Talk to me a little bit about the decisions on sort of how frequently do things need to get done? What was that a risk decision? Was it a convenience decision or not interrupt operations? But what are some of the factors you had to deal with there?
Yeah, the initial decision, Tony, was one of compliance. So compliance said I needed to scan every quarter. What were ways that I could meet that objective, but then look at things such as how quickly can I detect there's new pieces of hardware on my environment. So what I decided to do is to run daily scans, to not do a full interrogation, all the ports and protocols and services scans, but are there any new devices on my network since the last time I ran it? And the last time I ran that type of scan was 24 hours. So I made that determination of how can I be compliant with an objective that I have to do, but lean into control number one that says how long can I stand to not know there's a new device that's plugged into one of my important networks. And so again, having the automation of using a tool like Nmap or maybe other tools that are out there to look for that and alert and tell me when those changes occur was really a key to being able to do that, again, at no cost at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it wasn't sort of an absolute thing. It's once you had put in place a basic automation infrastructure, you're really looking for things that are changing and deciding whether that makes sense or not, sort of by exception. Okay, we're running low on time here. There's a number of other great questions that have been flying in here. Again, this is about your needs, not ours. So we'll do our best from CIS to compile these up, maybe combine some of these questions, and get some information back to anyone who's interested. Feel free to reach out to us, at the CIS website. And if you have questions that you want directed to one of the panelists, don't hesitate to let me know. And we'll see if we can make sure that we follow up on this. Again, this is about community building around ideas, not about a static list that you can just refer to, but about how do we help people achieve what's on these lists. So also let me offer our panelists. So I like to end a panel like this. Again, these are extraordinary folks, and we're very lucky to have them dedicate some of their busy workday to us here. But I'm going to offer our panelists a lightning round. That is, I'll give you 30 seconds or a minute or so. One last statement, one last thing you'd like to say, either to emphasize a point that you have made or something that just didn't come up during the course of this. And if you don't mind, Russell, I'll start with you.
Yeah, happy to do so. I would just encourage you to look at page 3, the overview, those 5 questions that are listed there, and answer those questions in your organization. Questions like, do you know what's connected to your computers and networks? You probably won't like the answer if you've never asked that question, but you can use that as an opportunity to lean into saying, what can we do in these particular areas to know better, to protect better, to prepare better, and really think in terms of what are some of the steps that we can do. Backing up your data is great. Good for you. You should do that. Have you considered what would it look like to be able to do a test case where you needed to be able to attempt to restore that data? Again, some of these steps are outlined in this guide that could really help get you motivated and help drive you towards action.
Yep, great starting point, Russell. Appreciate it. Hardeep, how about you? Any last thought you want to leave us with?
Yeah, and I like to echo Russell's comments there, is like knowing your environment is really, really critical, because typically it's not a matter if, it's a matter of when a breach occurs. As we're seeing a lot of organizations getting breached. So, practicing that instant response, but it circles back to really knowing your environment. You want to know your environment before a breach occurs. So, in the event, you can take appropriate action. And then, as Russell was echoing, like really, was mentioning that, backing up and actually testing and executing, like go through a scenario and see actually if you were affected by ransomware, what would happen and how would you react to that?
Yep, that's great. And a lot of that stuff that both of you guys have mentioned is not just security, right? It's just good management, good control, good visibility, that you understand the assets that you have and you're managing them. Let's finish up. Kristen, last thought from you.
The most important thing is reputation management. If you're going to own and run a small, medium enterprise, and you allow a data breach to happen and customer information is lost, your reputation is going to be on the line. And if you don't have a good reputation, will your customers continue to come and do business with you? So if you're trying to make that point to folks that they need to be paying attention to this, talk about risk management, but talk about reputation management and the fact that you want that shingle outside the door to mean that you can be trusted.
Wow, great point, Kristen. Yep, we go to these businesses because we trust them, and that's a wonderful point to end on here. So with that, I want to thank each of our panelists, again, an extraordinary group of people, contributors to the community. We're really lucky to have them involved with CIS as members of our volunteer community. You had some contact information. Don't hesitate, reach out to us. We'll do our best to get back to folks with answers to your questions. If you have other ones, don't hesitate, reach out to us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Robin.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you all for your interest in the CIS controls and participation in our webinar. Again, a special thanks to you, Tony, Hardeep, Russell, Kristen, and Phil for leading our discussion today. As a community-driven initiative, we rely on supporters like yourself to help drive the development of the CIS controls and related content. How to reach us, controls.info@cisecurity.org, our website, www.cisecurity.org. Our webinar has been recorded and will be available very soon on the CIS website. We look forward to have you back again for our next CIS webinar. Have a great day, everyone.